I grew up on a farm. When I wasn't working the farm or in school, I was playing in the woods that surrounded our property. I knew every inch of those woods, and my dad would take me there to go turkey hunting for Thanksgiving. So I've always felt safe in the woods. Not that I'd ever hang around in there after dark. The woods weren't haunted or anything, but there were wild bears and venomous snakes. I moved away to go to college and got a job in the city. I married a girl named Leah and had a couple of kids, Scott and Jason. As great as living in the city was, I felt Scott and Jason were missing out on being kids and playing in the woods as I did when I was their age. So imagine my excitement when my workplace relocated me to a town that was walking distance from a national park. I was so excited to take my boys out exploring in the woods. I took the boys and Leah into the woods at least once every weekend and taught them how to find their way with a compass, how to fish and hunt, and most importantly, how you should never go into the woods by yourself. I made sure Scott and Jason knew to always use the buddy system whenever they went off to play in the forested area behind our house, to hug a tree and blow a whistle should they get lost, and to always return to the whistle I kept around my neck. Fortunately, they were good friends and did practically everything together. One year, when Scott and Jason were 10 and 8 respectively, I decided to reward them for a good school year by taking them camping in the national park. Everyone was excited, especially Jason, who wanted to play with the compass he had gotten for Christmas the previous year. After getting to our campsite and setting up, we sent the boys off to play nearby, while Leah and I enjoyed some time alone. We got to talking when I got the strange sense that we were being watched from the south, just beyond the stream. I grabbed the water bucket and headed to the stream. That way, in case we were being watched, I could say I was filling a bucket of water. I filled the bucket and scanned the tree line. There was nobody there. I kept my eyes peeled, but I was feeling pretty foolish. What if I'm just seeing things? But I had been in forested areas long enough to know that if something didn't feel right, it probably wasn't right. I hurried back to the fire with the bucket. "Have you seen the boys?" I asked Leah. "Not since you sent them off. They promised to be back before sundown. Why do you ask?" Just curious." I was still feeling spooked from the strange feeling, so I continued watching for the boys. As the sun got closer to setting, Leah set up the campfire for cooking, and we prepared a quick meal. As the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, the more apprehensive I grew. I wanted nothing more than to get the boys and get us out of there. I was about ready to blow my whistle when Scott and Jason crashed through the trees. Their faces were white, and there was a shocked look on their faces. "Where have you guys been?" I asked, trying to hide how angry I was at them for taking so long. "We got chased by a man," Scott blubbered, clearly shocked. "A man?" I asked. "We were playing with the compass when this guy showed up. He smelled bad and was wearing rags," Jason said. "He was carrying this long knife with him and asked what we were doing in his woods." "His woods?" Leah asked from the campfire. "He said the woods had been in his family for generations and that the government had no right to take it away from him. He drew his knife and told us to run, so we did," Jason said. While I was trying to process the strange story the boys had told me, I heard a loud snap of a twig breaking from the area where the boys had crashed through. I took out my flashlight and shone my light into the area where the sound had come from. Sure enough, there was this huge man, wearing the rags of a Boy Scout uniform way too small for him, and smelling like he hadn't had a shower in several days. In his hand was a long and sharp machete. He glared at us. "That's the man!" Scott shouted, pointing. I grabbed the boys and screamed at Leah to run back to the car. We got out of there, running to the area where we had parked our car, not even bothering to put out the fire. Once we got in the car, we drove to the ranger station and reported what had happened. The rangers shared a look. This made me wonder if this was not the first time they had heard of him. They agreed to check it out and told us to stay put at the ranger station. 20 minutes later, they asked us to come down to the campsite. We went down there and saw that the place had been ransacked. Our tents had been slashed and our belongings scattered everywhere and in the still burning fire. The rangers told us we were lucky that the belongings and equipment were the only things that had been destroyed. We haven't been back since. The boys refused to play in the forested area behind the house. I don't blame them. The park rangers called the cops, who promised us they'd catch whoever was responsible. But I still get a chill whenever I get the strange sensation that were being watched. It was the middle of the night, and my roommate Jason started banging on my door. It woke me up instantly. I really needed to get some sleep before all my classes tomorrow, but he just wouldn't stop knocking. He shouted my name through the door. I pushed myself out of bed and answered, "What the hell?" Jason was very clearly drunk. He could barely stand on his own. He said that he wasn't able to drive, obviously. He said he needed me to drive to the 24-hour grocery store just off campus and get him Cheetos. I couldn't believe it. I told him no. I said I needed to get back to sleep, but he kept pestering me until I finally gave in. I figured that a quick trip to the shop would help me calm down. Besides, I'm not the most confident person, and it's really hard for me to say no to people. So I got in my car and drove to the grocery store. Aside from one cashier, it was completely empty. I grabbed a bag of Cheetos and some energy drinks that I'd have to use in the morning. I gave the cashier my stuff, but he just put them in a bag without scanning them. Then he told me that I owed him $50. I knew that wasn't right. I noticed that the man wasn't wearing the dark green shirts that the cashiers usually wore. He had a baggy flannel shirt and he looked kind of dirty. There was grass in his hair and his eyes were kind of glazed over. I felt like an idiot for not noticing this before. There was something very wrong with this man. "Are you sure it's $50? I asked. He leaned closer and whispered, "Are you calling me a liar?" I backed away and my foot brushed up against something on the floor. I looked down and saw the body of the real cashier. He was crumpled just under the next checkout line. His dark green uniform was stained with blood. I looked back at the fake cashier, who just smiled at me. He knew he'd been caught. "Oops," he said. Then he grabbed my bag and swung it at the side of my head. The cans of energy drinks hit me right in the temple. I felt woozy and had to catch myself on the shelves. Otherwise, I would have fallen right on top of the body. Then he jumped over the counter and tried to attack me. He grabbed me by the collar and started screaming at me. He said the most insane stuff about how he owned the grocery store now. He said that he was the new president of the store and that he'd kill me if I didn't pay him the $50. I didn't want to fight him, so I said, "Okay, I'll give you the money with a tip." He let go of my collar and smiled. He was missing most of his teeth. I reached into my pocket, but instead of pulling out my wallet, I grabbed the can of pepper spray I always kept with me. I blasted him in the face and then raced out of the store. The police were already outside. I guess they'd just arrived. They ran in and tackled the man to the ground. I watched through the windows as they cuffed him and took him away. I told an officer what I'd seen. He commended me for acting so brave, but I just got in my car and drove back to my apartment. Jason was waiting for me on the couch. "Where are the Cheetos?" he asked. "Get your own damn Cheetos," I told him. "I'm going to bed." From that day on, I stopped taking crap from him. If I could stand up to a murderer, I could stand up to anyone. I finally had the keys to my new house after weeks of anticipation. I was packed before the offer had even been accepted, and so when I got the keys, I wasted no time moving in. This was the start of a new chapter in my life, and a place I could call my own, without worrying that the landlord was going to show up and demand more rent from me, or accuse me of damaging his house. I was both nervous and excited. I'm in my early 20s and never bothered with college, as I really believe it's a waste of time for most. Instead of college, I decided to get a job at a local warehouse, packing inventory ready for shipment. It paid quite well, and there was always availability for overtime, which is how I saved up for a deposit. My whole life, people told me I was worthless and would never amount to anything, so to be so young and be on the property ladder really felt like a huge achievement for me. After I had moved all my stuff in and got the place looking how I wanted it to look, I started to notice a rotten smell coming from the dining room. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was drifting in from somewhere. But as the weeks went on, The smell continued to get stronger and stronger. I looked around the house, checking everywhere, including the basement, but I couldn't figure out where the smell was coming from, so I called someone in to try and help me figure out what it was. I had a man from pest control come out and instantly say that it was the smell of rotting flesh. He assured me that it was nothing to worry about and could be easily fixed. We just needed to locate the exact place the smell was coming from. I left him to do his thing, and an hour or so later, the man told me he was confident that the animal was somehow in the wall between my dining room and kitchen, and it wasn't going to be a cheap fix. He had to knock part of the wall down and then arrange for it to be fixed up again. I was frustrated and knew it was going to cost me, but I remember thinking that this is what it takes to be a homeowner, and I just had to live with it. I gave the go-ahead and went off, leaving the man from pest control to it. A short time later, he called me into the room, saying he had found the source of the problem and that I should come in and take a look. I couldn't believe my eyes when I walked in. Laid out on a plastic sheet were 4 dead dogs. The man from pest control told me I had to report it to the police, as they weren't there by accident and someone must have put them there. I called the police and waited for them to show up at my house when I noticed one of the dogs had a collar with a tag on. I called the number, and as it turns out, it was my next-door neighbor, Stefan. I hadn't really spoken to him other than a nod and a brief hello. Stefan came round, and I could tell by his face as soon as he walked in that it was his dog. Fighting back the tears, he also told me that the other dogs also belonged to our neighbors. As it turns out, the man who I bought the house off hated dogs and would always complain and argue with the neighbors about them. He didn't get on with anyone on the street, and he got his revenge just before he moved out. The police eventually turned up, and they called someone to come and take the dogs, saying they would need to have an autopsy to confirm their cause of death. I don't know what happened after that. People don't really talk to me from the street. I think they feel I'm partly responsible. When I was in college, I used to live in this small apartment just off campus. It was more expensive than the dorms, but it meant that I didn't have to share with anyone I didn't know, or more importantly, didn't like. I was very protective of my personal space, and I'd heard horror stories about people sharing rooms that didn't get along. It was getting close to Christmas, and we were all about to go home for the holidays, so we decided to celebrate by having a party at one of my friend's dorms on campus. We were able to get some alcohol, but I was never one to get wasted, as I didn't like to feel the hangover the next day, but I would have a couple of drinks. Towards the end of the party, I decided to go home. I let my friends know I was heading home, and Tristan and Sam offered to walk me back to my apartment. Tristan and Sam were a boyfriend and girlfriend. I wasn't Tristan's biggest fan at the time, as he could be a bit boisterous, and that wasn't really me, but he was a good guy deep down. Even though I said I was fine to make the journey alone, as it was less than 10 minutes away, my friends insisted and wouldn't allow me to walk home alone. I hadn't really noticed, but the snow had started coming down hard while we were all inside partying, and it was laying fast. Tristan threw some snowballs at other passing students, and they threw them back. It was a bit of fun, but as we got closer to the houses, Tristan decided to throw some snowballs at some of the residential windows. Both me and Sam told him not to, but he continued anyway. He then threw one snowball so hard that it shattered the glass of someone's window. Tristan and Sam started to run off, but I was more concerned that he could have hurt someone sleeping. I looked up to see a man walk to the window. He didn't turn on any lights, so I couldn't really see his face. He looked at me and pointed right at me, and then turned around to walk away. I started to run to catch up with Tristan and Sam. We managed to get to my apartment without him seeing us, and we decided it was best to lay low for a while. We left all the lights off and sat on the floor out of sight. A few minutes later, a rock came through my window.
"Come down here and pay for what you've done!"
I was confused as to how he managed to find us. He was nowhere in sight when we got back to my place. We looked out of the window from behind the curtains to see all the footprints leading up to the front door. It never even occurred to me, but as it was late at night, there were no other footprints in the snow, so it wasn't hard to find us. We couldn't really call the cops as we'd broken his window. The man started to kick the door repeatedly. I shouted at Tristan to do something, but before he could react, we heard the door give way. I didn't know what to do. We had nowhere to go as we all panicked. We heard the man coming up the stairs one step after another. He came down the hall and stopped outside my living room door. We all just stood still looking at each other. There was nothing we could do. Then the man turned the doorknob and slowly opened the door. As the man opened the door, he looked right at me. He was holding a small kitchen knife. My heart dropped. Tristan stood forward and told the man it was him that broke his window. The man laughed and slowly turned his head towards Tristan and then lunged at him, pinning him against the wall while holding the knife to his throat. Sam and I both screamed and started to cry while Tristan stood there pinned against the wall.
Midday tomorrow. Don't be late.
The man took the knife from Tristan's throat and walked out of the flat laughing as he walked down the stairs. The next morning we went with Tristan to the ATM and went to the house to drop off $200. We knocked on the door and an old lady answered.
Are you the ones who broke my window?
Tristan told her that he'd broken it by throwing a snowball too hard. The lady laughed and didn't seem angry. She seemed very sweet, in fact.
Never mind. At least you left a note and came back to pay for it.
What note?
The lady handed me a note that said, I'm sorry we broke your window. We'll return tomorrow before midday to pay for it. We asked where the man that lived here was, and if she'd make sure he knew we came back to pay for it.
What man?
She asked.
I live alone.
We never saw that man again after that. I don't know if they were messing with our heads, but if not, who was that man, and why was he in her house? I used to work security for a student halls of residence. I've submitted 1 or 2 stories here before, which you may or may not have heard. We had different duties and roles within our job description, depending on what we were assigned and whether we worked the day shift or the night shift. All of our sites, bar one, were manned, so we would have someone assigned as a night patrol officer. He or she would basically drive a large white van between all the sites, offering backup and patrolling the sites, ensuring there was nothing going on that shouldn't be, and that there were no health and safety issues. It was my job tonight to drive between the sites, making sure everything was okay, and responding to any calls and complaints. I started my 12-hour shift at 7 p.m. as usual, and would visit each residency 3 times throughout the night, and spend anywhere up to an hour at each one. This night was like any other night. The area we worked was near 2 large universities and several major colleges, so there was always students out partying and causing trouble. One of the areas where the students lived wasn't all that safe. A bit of a rundown neighborhood, you might say. There was a high amount of unemployment and crime in the area, but houses were cheap, so people bought them to rent out to students. Students would rent them usually without checking on the area first. They generally never stayed in the area for a second year. It got to about 3 in the morning, and this was usually where you would see people stumbling home drunk. The boys would be chanting and being rowdy, the girls usually screaming and giggling. As I drove down this one long road, 3 males ran out of nowhere right in front of me. They were so close I nearly hit one of them and had to slam on the brakes. I watched them run off into the housing and continued to drive while looking around to see what they were fleeing from. I couldn't see anything, so continued to drive on when I got this strange feeling that something wasn't right. Something told me to go back and check. This wasn't even my responsibility, but my curiosity and instinct got the better of me. I drove back to where the 3 men had come running from, to find a young girl laying on the floor in hysterics, crying. I didn't see her from the road, as she was behind some trees. She was easier to spot coming up from the other side. She had a sparkly red dress on and was coming home from a night on the town or maybe even a party. She was vulnerable, and I had no idea what had happened to her, but something had happened to her. I tried to introduce myself to her, and let her know she was safe. I offered my driver's license to her and told her I was going to call the police and that I'd wait with her until they arrived. She didn't say a word to me, so I just reassured her she was safe, and I sat with her while she just laid there and continued to cry. It's a difficult situation to be in for a man. I wanted to try and get her to safety, even if it was just to sit in the van until the police came. I'm not sure I could take on these 3 men if they came back. But then, what if she screams while I try to help her? Others might think I'm the attacker, or that I'm trying to kidnap her and come to her aid. I think I would rather get beat up than accused of attempted kidnapping or whatever, so I just sat there, reassuring her that help was on the way. Eventually, the police came, and after talking with her, they put her in the police car and took her away. I gave the best description I could, but I didn't see much as it all happened so fast. I don't know what the intentions of these men were. Were they robbing her? Were they about to do something worse? Did they do something worse? I'm not really sure, but I'm confident that the sound of the van I was driving disturbed them. I'm glad I followed the instinct I felt, telling me to go back and check. As sad as it was that it happened, for me to be in the right place at the right time, I'm certain that something was looking out for her. When I was 12, I had a best friend named Elizabeth, but I just called her Lisa. Not a weekend slipped by that we weren't at each other's house. It was our normal until we reached high school. In high school, our personalities began to switch. While I was busy doing normal teenage girl things, like being boy-crazed and buying makeup that turned me orange, Lisa was focused on more morbid things. I watched her replace all the colors in her wardrobe to drab blacks and ripped jeans. Don't get me wrong, that's all fine. It was the personality shift that accompanied it that was the main concern. One weekend, Lisa invited me to a sleepover that she was throwing at her house. She had mentioned briefly that 2 of her other friends would be there, whom I didn't know well at all. But desperate to not let our friendship falter anymore, I said I'd be there. I thought that if we could just hang out like we used to, we could make things right again and go back to how they'd been. After school, my dad drove me to her house and saw me to the door. If my dad would have looked a little closer, he would have seen that there were no cars out front. The chaperoned sleepover wasn't chaperoned at all. Not wanting to appear like a snitch, I ignored it and walked in. Greeting me on the sofa was Lisa and her friends. 2 of them I knew as juniors. Their names were Raven and Draven. No, that isn't their real names, but to be honest, I never found out their real names. Then, in the recliner, was another guy I had never seen before. He looked older, way older. He had the sides of his head shaved, and the mohawk that was supposed to be sticking straight up laid limply to one side. He wore pants that were adorned with chains, and a fishnet long-sleeve shirt over a black tank. I did my best to avoid eye contact, and play things off cool to avoid making a fool out of myself. When I got closer to the unknown guy, I noticed the smell of cigarette smoke was emanating from him. It was nauseating. All of them had this distant look in their eyes, like the lights were on but nobody was home. I felt like I should turn around and walk out. Forget looking weak. The atmosphere was oppressive and dim. I wanted no part of it. Nobody spoke to me when I first arrived besides Lisa. The others were too busy in their own conversation. I could feel their eyes sizing me up to see if I would be able to fit in with the cool kids, when I heard a gruff voice pierce through the teenage giggling. Even talking, he didn't sound like he was our age. He sounded like a grown man. Feeling a bit more self-conscious, I watched as Lisa walked to the kitchen and came back holding beer. Confused, I just blinked a few times. Lisa had never mentioned alcohol before, so this was new. And while looking at her, the man took time to set up a game board on the floor. It didn't stick out to me until I noticed it wasn't a game board, or at least a friendly Monopoly game. It was a Ouija board. My brain started whirring 1,000 times a minute. I had never personally played with one, but my parents were strongly against them. I didn't quite understand the point, considering it was sold at Books A Million. Surely they wouldn't sell toys to talk to demons. As soon as he was done making sure it was ready to go, everyone's face lit up, except mine. I can't explain the feeling that came next, just that it was not welcome. I stayed rooted in my spot as they all set about lighting candles and pulling curtains. Not eager to get involved, I stayed back on the couch while they shifted on the floor. As any teenagers, they gave me grief for not partaking, and dumbly, I gave in. With 2 fingers from each of us placed on the wooden and glass triangular piece that I know now as a planchette, we began. It wasn't until the start that I learned the man's name was Weasel, and I was right. He was a man. He was 26. Why he was hanging out with 15-year-olds is a whole different type of horror story, but I digress. He was the one who started asking the questions. To start with, they were harmless questions. Is anyone there? Are we alone? Stupid stuff that everyone asks, but slowly it turned more sinister. Weasel's questions turned into direct questions about darker beings. One question asked for a harbinger of darkness. It was all around strange. Everyone else seemed to love it. It was during one of the questions on harbingers that the planchette began to move slowly. I went to jerk my hand away, which caused all of them to scream at me to put my hands back down. I did, but only because I saw fear flash in their faces. I knew I wasn't doing it, but I began to question if one of them was behind it to freak me out. I watched it glide effortlessly around the letters D-E-A-T-H. Everyone looked at each other smiling, and caught up in the moment, I forgot the question he asked was what the harbinger was a messenger of. The answer was death. It continued to circle the letters repeatedly. Weasel continued to ask more from it. How do we know this is real? Death for who? Your own death? If something's there, prove it to me, or else this is stupid and you're too weak, or it's just a joke. I felt myself flinch as he continued to become more aggressive towards whatever was happening. While I didn't want to believe it, I watched enough ghost shows to know that poking a sleeping bear wasn't a smart idea. To my horror, after the last statement, the planchette froze. It didn't freeze over anything, just stopped. It freaked out the others too, judging by how they all tensed. Our hands stayed frozen on the board for what felt like an eternity, until Weasel became fed up and removed his fingers. One of you had to do all that. There's no way something powerful would ignore me. Nobody ignores me. Assuming it was safe, since the ringleader moved his fingers, everyone else went to do the same. I was the last one with fingers still on it. I thought I was imagining it, but I felt the board move. It was subtle, that if you weren't touching it, you'd never know. I was in the middle of debating whether to follow everyone and move my fingers or just wait it out. I was too lost in my own thoughts that I didn't notice Weasel leaning forward on hands and knees to snatch the board from under my hands until I was forced to notice. I didn't have a chance to react before the board that had been under my fingers was no longer there. I watched in awe as the board came up and shot right by Weasel's face, hitting the wall with a thud and then falling to the floor. Everyone yelped except for me and Weasel. I was still in the throes of processing, and Weasel just developed a wide grin. It was like he witnessed the coolest of magic tricks. Weasel didn't even have time to make a move to the board before I felt a cold chill on the back of my neck. I was shaking by now. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room as the candle we had lit went out. I don't know who it was, but someone gripped my hand for dear life. Weasel, who just didn't know when to shut up, started saying that whatever just happened was weak. It was a practical scare everyone had seen. Lisa and the other 2 were telling him to shut up. Weasel made his way and flipped the lights back on, pointing back to the board and telling us to put our hands back on it. No one wanted to, and stood firm in the resolute no. He was angry. Then, his anger turned toward things unseen in the room. He continued to belittle the air and yell cuss words left and right. This went on for 2 whole minutes. Then, it stopped. Weasel let out a groan and grabbed his stomach. None of us had time to reach him before he was on the ground and twitching. With the lights on, we could see his fists were in a ball, and his eyes had rolled back to show the whites only. Lisa was freaking out, so it took me moving from safety to call for an ambulance. They told us to make sure nothing was around him that could hurt him, so I pulled everything away from him. He continued to writhe even after paramedics came. Those fellas were going in circles, running wires all over him until they could manage to lift him onto the bed and wheel him out. Not even caring about the friendship, I called my parents to come get me. I didn't care that I was going to be grounded for life. I just wanted to get out. It wasn't until later that I realized a major issue. We never said goodbye on the board. For months after I contributed any bad luck to whatever we made contact with that night. As for Lisa, she was grounded for having an adult man at her house and throwing a party without telling her folks. I heard that they said Weasel's seizure was from the medication he was on and the alcohol combination. Medically, it makes sense. I don't buy it though. I think he just pissed off the wrong force, and that was its way of showing it wasn't weak. I used to be a night shift security guard for a mall that was right in the heart of several neighboring towns. I was working the night shift alone when a motion sensor for one of the stores was triggered. This happened every now and again, but didn't necessarily mean that someone was in the building. Sometimes the air conditioning units were left on in the store, and it would blow some clothing hung up on a rail, triggering the sensor, or a poorly stacked display would fall over randomly. The first time I responded to a sensor trigger, my heart was beating out of my chest, and I was thinking anything and everything of what could have potentially triggered the sensor. It could be an intruder, a wild animal, or even a ghost. I'd walk around looking over my shoulder at every turn. Your mind will play tricks on you when you're alone in a secluded place at night. By the 10th time this happened, it just felt like another day at the office. The alarm would trigger, and I would follow protocol, which was to go and check in and around the store and then document my findings. On this one night, a sensor triggered in one of the larger stores within the mall. This store had everything from toys to appliances to clothing. I attached my body cam, which we were made to wear if we left the office, and set off on my patrol. I arrived at the store, and nothing seemed unusual or out of place. The lights were energy-saving lights, so it didn't emit as much light as during the day, making it harder to see. I walked around the dimly lit store, checking for any signs of unusual activity. I checked behind the counters, walked all the aisles, and even checked the changing room stalls. All the curtains were pulled back on the stalls, so I could see straight into them without the need to physically go and check. To be honest, if there was someone in the store, there would be many places to hide that we didn't check. But as long as we followed protocol and walked around, there was no comeback. I didn't find anything, and I made my way back to the office. I then had to upload my body cam footage to our systems and record them in the file. I watched the body cam footage as it was uploaded to make sure I had checked everything correctly. As I was watching the footage, I saw something I had missed on my initial patrol. There appeared to be a pair of feet standing in one of the clothes rails I walked past. It could have just been a pair of shoes left out or thrown there by a customer who decided not to buy them but were too lazy to put them back. It happens more often than you'd think, so it hardly seemed worthy of calling for backup or the police. I walked back to the store, a little more on edge than I was the first time. We are not licensed to carry, and therefore had limited equipment to protect ourselves. Just mace and a nightstick, which I had never needed to use. Our duty was to observe and report. I arrived at where I had seen the feet standing in the clothes rail, and there was no one there. I went to stand at the area where the body cam caught the image to see if there was maybe something that made it look as if someone was standing there, but there was nothing there. Again, I looked behind the counters, walked the aisles, but when I got to the changing room stalls, something was different. I noticed one of the curtains on the changing room stalls was closed. I specifically remember them all being open earlier, as I didn't have to go in to check them. I took out my mace and slowly started to walk towards the stalls.
If anyone's in there, come out now. I'm armed and will shoot if necessary.
There was no movement and no one came out. I slowly approached and pulled back the curtains to find no one there. It was a sigh of relief, but I was now convinced someone else was in the store. I decided to make my way back to the office and call for assistance. As I was walking to the exit at the back of the store, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like something being knocked or moved. I looked back, scanning from left to right and back again, when I noticed a mannequin standing on the edge of the sporting goods section. I didn't notice this earlier, but I wasn't 100% it wasn't there. I approached with caution and stood staring at the face, which was wearing a hockey mask. I couldn't really see what was underneath it due to the lighting, but then the head lifted up and eyes opened. I fell backwards, and before I could lift my arm to spray him with mace, the guy started to run towards the emergency exit. I started to run after him, but he was much faster than I was. He burst out of the doors into the parking lot, and I left him there. Observe and report. I'm not paid enough to chase someone out into the open. I had done my duty, so I ensured the doors were locked and made my way back to the office. It was reported to the police, but we were unable to find any footage of the man other than him being in that store after hours, and with no clear image of his face, there's nothing they could really do. When I was a teen, my family just couldn't afford a car. I had a brother in the ICU and a baby sister who was born deaf. Suffice to say, we were broke. So as soon as I was physically able, I started working to try and help out, and to get to and from my job, I had no other option but to take the bus. Now, at that time, I didn't care about taking the bus that much. Yes, it was kind of humiliating seeing my friends getting their cars and learning to drive, while I had to waste almost an entire hour waiting for some middle-aged fat dude to roll by in the Junkie Express, but I could at least find some pride in the fact that doing it made my parents' life easier. Getting to work wasn't that bad anyway. It was fine, if not a little too loud. It was getting back from work that was a problem. I had to take 2 buses, and the second one was the last to run that route for the day. If I missed it, I would have to walk 1.5 miles to get an alternative bus that would leave me 0.5 mile away from home instead of just a couple of yards. When that happened, it meant that I wouldn't get home before midnight and that I would have to ride with actual meth heads. It was awful, and I avoided it like the plague. Nevertheless, it happened. I was a teen and mistakes were made. I sometimes screwed up and had to stay late and help clean something up, or just got carried over talking with some work colleagues after the shift was over. And it was in one of those times that I met Harry. Now, at first glance, Harry wasn't special. He was just another addict in a city filled with them. He was always groggy, and judging by his arms, he was a hardcore heroin addict. What set him apart was the fact that Harry was actually nice. The dude looked out for me. We had a few interactions, and he sympathized with me for whatever reason. I would see him maybe once or twice a month, and he would always remember me, give me some advice, offer me a smoke, or ask my opinion over some bullshit he wrote, and I would play ball with him. At first because I was afraid he'd turn on me, but then because he was actually an okay person. But things went sideways, like they always do when addicts don't kick the habit. Harry must have had a bad cut that night. It's the only reasonable explanation. He was completely out when I got on the bus, and he stayed out for most of the trip. And when he woke up, well, things changed. Now, after a while, you get used to loud and weird people on buses. You get used to not caring that much about other people and what they do. But Harry wasn't acting up. He wasn't shouting. He just woke up and panicked. He was afraid and silent, making himself smaller as if he were hiding from something. He got up and started looking around. There were 5 other people on the bus with us, and he looked at all of them, turning his head almost instantly, refusing to look anyone in the eyes, including me. He waddled up to the bus driver, barely able to stand, shivering. He tapped the driver on the shoulder, to which he promptly responded by telling Harry to sit down. He did it again, and the driver turned his head to shout at him, but as soon as he did that, Harry just gave him a quick look and ran back. The dude wasn't tweaking. He was terrified, standing instead of sitting, and looking around as if he were a concerned animal looking for an out. It started making people on the bus anxious. I decided to try and calm him down. It was stupid, but I felt like I was the only person there he would listen to, that we were buddies. It was a big mistake. "Hey man, are you okay?" I asked, standing up and trying to walk towards him slowly. "Get the fuck away from me!" he shouted, with a mix of hate and fear in his voice. "Dude, it's me. It's Mike. Calm down." I tried touching him on the shoulder, speaking as softly as I could. "You're not Mike!" he screamed, pushing me away. "I don't know who the fuck you all are and what we're doing here, but I want out. You heard me? Out! Let me out!" Some dude in the back started shifting around his seat, and another piped up. "Just pull the lever and the driver will let you out on the next stop. No need for any of this, you freak." "I'm not the freak! You are! You're all freaks! Get away! Get the fuck away!" He kept screaming. I felt sick and shocked. He had a look in his eye that I've never seen since. And then it happened. Harry pulled his knife. It was a switchblade. He must have carried it in his pocket. He pulled it and leapt towards me, all in a single motion. I caught him mid-movement and held his arm as we both fell to the bus floor. The driver immediately pulled the brake and leapt out of his seat, running towards us as the bus doors opened. "Where are we?" Harry screamed as he tried to stab me. "What is happening? Where are we?" I didn't answer. I didn't have the time to. The driver and 2 other passengers pulled Harry from me and disarmed him. They threw him out of the bus, and at that point Harry could have fled, and then maybe it would be a weird but funny story to tell my grandkids someday. But he didn't. They didn't let him get away. They grabbed him off the ground and beat him, punched and kicked him until he was green and blue and red all over. He kept screaming for help, but no one came, and eventually he just stopped, and they weren't satisfied until he did. The police came after a while. Someone on the bus called. At that point, Harry was shivering on the floor, sobbing, asking for someone to save him. I was so scared. I kept looking at him and feeling guilt, this enormous guilt, like I had brought this upon him. He attacked me. I should be glad, but I wasn't. The police got our statements. Everyone exaggerated what he did at least a little, made him into some psychotic druggie, and maybe he was, I don't know. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I played along. I didn't tell them he was scared. I didn't tell them he didn't try to fight back against the men who beat him. I didn't really tell them anything. I rode that bus again a few more times, but I never saw Harry again. I did see the driver, however, and I did occasionally see the other 2 men who beat him, and whenever I saw them, I thought about Harry and his beaten body on the sidewalk. These days, I don't take the bus anymore. Not if I can help it. I'm not proud to admit it, but a few years ago I didn't have much respect for myself and would sleep around with guys pretty much any day of the week. You can say whatever you want. I had low self-worth, no confidence, daddy issues, you name it, and I probably had it. I would meet men through various dating apps and social media platforms and would just go to their house, Netflix and chill, and then go home. Rarely more than a one-night stand, and I wouldn't usually stay the entire night. There were a couple of guys I would see occasionally more than once, but I always made it clear it was just friends with benefits. Most guys like this idea, all the good stuff with none of the headache, one guy even said to me. I had met up with this guy a few times and he was alright. I didn't mind his company. He was quite funny and wasn't interested in anything serious. He lived in a shared house, and this one night I stayed over. We did our Netflix and chill and fell asleep afterwards. I woke up in the early hours. The room was dark, but I saw a light coming from under the duvet. I lifted it to see what it was, and it was Leon. He was taking pictures of me while I was asleep. I started screaming at him. He went all sheepish and asked me to keep it down so his housemates wouldn't hear. It was too late for that. 2 of his housemates came banging on the door and asked what was going on and if I was okay. I got dressed and let them in and told them I had just caught him under the duvet, either taking pictures of me or filming me as I slept. They told him to show me what was on the phone so I could see what he was doing and to make sure everything was deleted. Leon contested, but was given the ultimatum that if he didn't show me, then the police would be called. I saw photos and videos of at least 3 other girls that he filmed sleeping. It was hard to tell as you never saw their face, but it was still creepy as hell. He begged us not to report him to the police and said he would do anything. His housemates told him to completely wipe his phone and leave. just get your stuff and go, and don't come back, which is exactly what he did. This woke me up to the type of men out there, and I deleted all my social apps. It made me realize that I wasn't getting the validation I was craving from just meeting up with random men. So I took 6 months to work on myself, and I feel so much better for it.
Back in the 80s, I used to love the 4th of July. My family was never a, we'll go to the carnival and have fun kind of family. We were shut-ins, and we never really cared for our neighbors. I was 14 at the time, the middle child, and to put it bluntly, we didn't like people. Still, we commemorated in our own little way. It was pretty simple. We would get in the car, pack a bunch of meat and cold beverages, and go hike up this hill that gave us a nice view from the carnival fair. We would start a bonfire and flip some burgers and hot dogs, which we would feast on while watching the fireworks. It was fun, and it was just us. We were a big family. Mom, Dad, my 4 brothers, and me. We didn't need anyone else. But that night, I wished we were at the carnival. I wish we were in the crowd. We lived in a small town, and we knew something was up as soon as we got close to our little hiding spot. There was a car near the trail we would have to hike, haphazardly parked there as if it had been abandoned, hidden among the bushes. A car we didn't recognize with an out-of-state license plate. No one ever shared our hill with us, and you can call my dad paranoid, but as soon as he saw it, he immediately went to our car and got a gun from the glove box. Everyone tensed up, but he assured us that nothing bad was going to happen, that it was just in case we needed it, and that we were still going to have a nice outdoor dinner. We went on to have a tense hike up the hill. We knew we were trailing behind someone. We could see deep boot marks, as if the dude were stomping up the trail. My dad hesitated a lot of times, at every single turn almost, and I could see him pondering if we should stop and turn around every time he saw the boot marks going the same way our usual spot was. Eventually, we started getting really freaked out. I mean, what if someone was waiting to ambush us when we got there? But then, when we were just half an hour from nightfall, their path diverged from ours. Dad couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. When we got to the top, it was already dark, so we wasted no time setting up our bonfire and starting our little party. We had fun. We told each other stories. My brother Caleb played guitar, and we sang along. It was super cool. I ate like a pig, and Dad showed me how to handle his gun, and even though he didn't let me shoot it, I still felt like such a badass holding it. But then, the fireworks started, the main event, and everything went to shit. The fireworks would light up the hill, and with each explosion, we would form an image from the spot 50 yards downhill from us. My mom was the first one to point it out, but we all saw it. At first, there was a man, a huge man wearing a black coat and a baseball cap. There was a shovel going up, throwing chunks of dirt up in the air, and finally, there was a bag, a huge black bag, laying still right behind him. It wasn't entirely clear, but I remember thinking it looked like a body bag. I looked around, and I could feel panic setting in. No one knew what to do. Everyone saw it, and everyone knew what it meant. Our youngest, Brian, almost let out a scream that was promptly cut by our mom putting her hand over his mouth. Dad snapped out of it pretty quickly. He whispered very quietly for us to stay down and not move a muscle, and that's exactly what we did. We didn't move, we just let him do it. The fireworks went on for about 5 more minutes, and with each explosion, we flinched as we watched him dig. We wanted to do something, our dad especially, but what exactly could we do? We didn't have cell phones at the time to call the cops. Whoever it was already dead, and the youngest kid we had with us was barely 9, so how could we justify fighting him? Dad had a gun, but who's to say that man didn't as well? He wouldn't risk it, he couldn't, and it rendered us effectively powerless to do anything about it. But the worst part, the part that ruined me, it was when, right before the fireworks stopped, he pulled what looked to be a woman from the bag and threw her into that shallow grave. I could hear my mom gagging. Brian started sobbing quietly and hid his face in the ground. Dad moved to cover my eyes, and I didn't even react. I was too shocked to even move. The fireworks stopped, and I felt my dad's hand slipping from my face. We stood there still, hearing as he moved the dirt and covered her body in the dark. We stood there until dawn, paralyzed by fear. When the sun rose, we figured it was safe, so we got up and trekked down the hill quietly, completely paranoid about every little detail. When we got to the start of the trail, the strange car wasn't there anymore. We got to our car, and no one could even blink. We went home, and we didn't talk about it. When we got home, my dad called the police. We told them what we saw. Dad gave them directions, and Mom spared no gruesome details. They were pretty chilled by it, and sent a few cars there, confirming the body of a deceased Jane Doe. Eventually, there was no reason for the cops to be there anymore, and we all felt weirdly unsafe when they went away. Sure, we were home, but in a way, we brought that man and what he did to that woman back with us. My dad didn't want to act scared, but I saw it in his eyes. Not scared for him, but scared for his family. When I was younger, the kids around the playground used to say that Old Man Harold killed his wife and fed her to his dog. I mean, my brother Jonesy and I never believed the stories, but that's not to say we weren't scared to death of walking past his house after school. We took extra caution because Harold was our neighbor, definitely not the type of neighbor to borrow milk from or invite over for a barbecue. My mom said Harold was to be left alone and that the stories I heard at school weren't true, and that was that. But there was one Saturday evening, one evening that I would never forget, when my brother and I regrettably spoke to the man. Sure, we had talked with him before, his wife too, but that was before she had passed away. Jonesy hadn't yet had his growth spurt, as my dad used to say, and so when I chucked my little brother our green frisbee, not even his biggest leap could stop it from going right over his head and into Harold's yard. Jonesy was so terrified of going over to fetch it that he wouldn't even play me at rock, paper, scissors to decide who was going to retrieve it. We were going to go together, he said. End of story. Thinking to myself about the schoolyard stories, I reluctantly agreed. We could hardly see anything that frigid winter evening, but my brother knew to follow the white of my sneakers as we made our way to the neighbor's lawn. The fence out front was shorter, chest height for me, and probably waist height for an adult. I managed to slide over the top, but had to help Jonesy over. Our neon frisbee stood out vividly against Harold's grass. I walked over and reached to grab it, but when I looked up, Harold had emerged from his screen door. So stood his dog, a vicious breed I couldn't name at my age, back when I only knew Labrador and Husky. Bits of slime hung loosely from its lips. The dog opened its mouth, but no bark ever came, only the noise of a screaming yelp, one that sounded like a woman's voice, nothing like a dog's cry. The man stood as a mere silhouette in the moonlight, the soft gleam of silver sparkling off his tall, sharp trowel. "She doesn't bite unless I make her," he said nonchalantly. Pale, unblinking globes were staring back at me and my brother. "I thought your dog was a boy," my brother started. I swiped the frisbee, and the canine launched like I had just nabbed his chew toy. Flailing backwards, I toppled over the front fence. My brother soon followed. The dog whined again. It clamped planks of wood between its jaws as it struck the fence, growling at us as we ran away. Back at home, my brother and I never said a word to Mom or Dad. They had warned us about the old man next door, and we had ignored them. If we told them what had happened, it could only make things worse. It's been years since that night, and I'm in college. But now that I'm older, do I believe Harold murdered his wife? Probably not. Do I think that it was really his wife's voice crawling out of his pet dog? Definitely not. I think the mind plays scary tricks when you're young and afraid. However, did I think that he would hurt my brother and I if our frisbee went over his fence again? That's a different story.
I went out with this girl we'll call Jane for the purpose of this story. Me and Jane had been in a serious relationship for several years, and I even planned on proposing to her on Valentine's Day a few years back. Although she was the sweetest, kindest girl who I did genuinely fall in love with, she also had some very concerning behavioral issues. She would get angry for no reason and start shouting at me and throwing things around the room. She hit me on a couple of occasions and tried to tell our friends that I was the aggressor. She would complain she had no money, then when she got paid from her job, would spend all her money on drinking and makeup within a few days, only to then complain that she had no money again. This is fine when you're in your teens or even in your 20s, but we were in our early 30s. I wanted to settle down and start thinking about a family and buying a house, and as much as I loved Jane, it just seemed that she wasn't about to grow up anytime soon. I decided that I couldn't cope with her unpredictable behavior and decided to call it off. She didn't take it too well, but said she was going to break up with me anyway, so wasn't really bothered. Jane moved out, and soon after I started dating again. A few months went by, and I didn't really hear anything from Jane, and I started seeing this other girl, and after our third date, decided to go back to hers where I spent the night. About 4 a.m, I received a call from Jane's friend, saying she was with Jane in my bedroom and didn't know what to do.
"Oh, what do you mean you're in my room?"
Jane still had a key to my place and had let herself in. Her friend called me to say she only came with her to make sure Jane didn't do anything stupid. I lived with my family, including my brother, his wife, and their 2 children, so although this was a bit crazy, I gave her the benefit of the doubt that I thought she wouldn't really do anything to hurt anyone. I remember thinking she was most likely just drunk and hurting, especially if she found out I was dating someone new. I kind of made excuses as to why this was acceptable behavior when, on reflection, I realized it's not. I decided to just leave her to it rather than going home and getting into an argument at 4 a.m. with all my family asleep in their rooms. I didn't want to call the police, as I really didn't want the drama. Jane's friend messaged me to say they were now laying in my bed waiting for me to get home. I ignored the message and went back to sleep, thinking whatever happens, happens. She loved my family and knew she wasn't a threat to them. I didn't receive any more messages that night. I arrived home the next day at about midday. I went into my bedroom and everything had been moved and thrown into the middle of my room. On the wall, written in red lipstick, it read, "I could have killed you in your sleep." I didn't call the police, but I did change the locks. I've not seen anything of Jane since that night, but I did bump into her friend a few weeks back. Jane was recently arrested and charged for stabbing a guy she had been dating. She apparently broke into his house one night while he was sleeping and stabbed him 3 times in the leg. He was okay and lived to tell the tale, but it just goes to show how, even when you really know someone, you can still really misjudge what they're capable of. My dad kicked me out of the house when I told him I was gay. Honestly, I thought Mom would be the one who'd freak out, but she just sat there silently while Dad started screaming at me to leave. This was last December. I was 26, still am, and had just gone back to my hometown to spend the holidays with my family. It had been my first time back in 3 years. I grabbed my backpack and ran out of the house. I didn't even get to say goodbye to my little brothers, who had probably heard the entire argument. I got in my car and called my boyfriend back in California. I could barely get the words out because I was crying so hard, but he could tell what had happened. He told me to book myself into a hotel for the night. He said I could drive back in the morning after I calmed down. My family lives in rural Arizona, so there weren't any good hotels nearby. I ended up finding a small one off the highway called Sunshine Hotel. It was a single-story building with faded paint and an empty pool. Normally, I wouldn't be caught dead in a place like this, but I didn't have a choice. I went into the lobby and saw an extremely handsome man working the check-in desk. He looked about my age. His eyes were amber, almost yellow. He smiled and said there were plenty of rooms available. Of course there were. He gave me a key to room 12, which was the one at the far end of the hotel. As he handed me my key, he said, "Don't worry, I keep good watch over this place. You'll be safe here." I thought that was a weird thing to say, but I guess he could tell that I'd been crying. My room was as grimy as I'd expected. I dropped my backpack on the table and double-checked that my door was locked. You can never be too careful in a place like this. Just as I went into the bathroom for a long, hot shower, I heard a loud knock on my door. I switched off the water and went to look through the peephole. A woman stood right outside. Her head was lowered, so I couldn't see her face, but she seemed shaky and desperate. "Hello?" I called through the door. She didn't look up. She whispered something. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Please let me in," she whispered. Normally, I would have told her to go away, but I'd just been through one of the worst moments of my life, and I couldn't stand to see someone so desperate standing right outside my doorstep. I wanted to help her. Besides, she seemed small and frail. She didn't look like a threat. Keeping the chain lock in place, I opened the door a few inches. She didn't move. She whispered something again, but I still couldn't hear. I leaned closer. I really needed to see her face. "Miss?" I said. "What's the problem? I can't hear you." She whispered something else, but I could only make out a single word. "Sorry." Just then, someone slammed against the door. The chain snapped and the door flew wide open. There was another person outside, hiding next to the door. It was a tall, fat man with tattoos covering his arms and neck. Before I could say anything, he charged at me. I fell backwards, and he walked into the room. The woman did too. I'm in pretty good shape, but this man was twice my size. As I tried to get back up, he kicked me in the stomach and headed for my backpack. The woman stood over me and watched. Now that I could see them up close, I noticed that they both had amber-colored eyes, just like the man at the front desk. Right then, I knew that these three people were related, probably siblings. They were working together to rob me, or worse. I figured that their brother had tipped them off about me. The woman started giggling. She pulled a knife out of her back pocket and waved it through the air, staring at me as she did. The brother rifled through my stuff. Again, I tried to stand up, but the woman jumped down and stabbed me once in the shoulder. It should have hurt, but I was too angry to feel it. I guess all my own frustrations were coming out at once. All of the anger at my own family, mixed with the violation of being attacked, it was just too much. Without even realizing what I was doing, I kicked the woman in the legs. She toppled to the ground. The big guy turned toward me, my wallet in his hand, but by then I was already at my feet. I dove at him. I didn't have the strength to take him down, but I had the anger. I grabbed him by the neck and squeezed until he dropped my wallet. He tried to push me off him, but I wouldn't let go. I was screaming, out of control. With all his strength, he shoved me back onto the floor. He pulled out another knife. They both stood over me, their amber eyes furious. They were going to kill me. Then I heard someone cock a gun. I looked at the front door and saw the guy from the lobby enter. He had a pistol raised toward his siblings.
Get out of here now!
The two attackers raised their arms and ran off. The man with the gun ran toward me. He wasn't like the others at all. "Are you okay?" he asked. I felt my shoulder. Hot blood had soaked my shirt. "I think so." "I'm gonna call the police," he said, helping me to my feet. "God, I hate my family sometimes." I smiled at him. I know the feeling.
I'd been through a difficult breakup. My girlfriend had cheated on me, and I had taken it very badly. The evenings were the worst. Sat on my own in my flat, lonely and bored, so I decided to get a job selling tickets in the local movie theater. I thought it would help to occupy my mind and bring in a little extra cash now the ex had moved out and I had to pay all the bills myself. I lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone, so I'd see lots of friends while I worked. It was nice. I definitely made the right decision. Unfortunately, my ex-girlfriend also came along with her new boyfriend every Wednesday night. It was like a kick in the teeth every time, but I just had to grin and bear it. But other than that, the job suited me well. But one day, there was a tragedy. Old Mrs. Everett was watching Jurassic Park when she suddenly had a massive heart attack and died, right there in seat C7. Some say she was terrified to death when the dinosaurs appeared, but to my mind, her 40 cigarette a day habit had finally caught up with her. She was 82. She'd done well considering, and at least she died in the best seat in the house. The next day was equally as eventful. A little boy tripped as he left the building and very nearly fell under a car. His poor little face was so badly grazed. I knew that loose tile was our responsibility, so I immediately tried to make amends by refunding their tickets. I just needed to get the stubs and I could give them a cash refund. I noticed with mild curiosity that the boy had been sitting in C7, the seat where Mrs. Everett had passed away. Once I'd noticed this connection, I started paying more attention to who sat in that seat, and I felt like I might be going mad, but bad things certainly did seem to happen more regularly to those who sat in C7. An old school friend lost his job. Mr. Hall, who had taught me at school, was diagnosed with cancer, and a teenager fell off her bike and broke her leg. All this could easily have been a coincidence, but it just kept on happening. Sometimes it was small things, but whenever anyone mentioned any personal misfortune, I'd check the list I'd made of who had sat in C7, and more often than not, their name would be on it. The butcher cut off his own thumb, and a boy from the lumber yard was involved in a car crash. Everyone talked about how the town seemed to be having a run of bad luck. I mentioned my theory about seat C7 to my boss. I even suggested he remove that seat, but he dismissed it as nonsense. He wasn't going to lose money by removing a seat because I was superstitious, especially when it was the best seat in the cinema, right in the middle with a great view of the screen. I did, however, notice that he himself never sat in C7. It turned into something of a macabre hobby. Someone would sit in C7, and the next time I saw them, I'd always make a point of asking how they were. More often than not, some sort of misfortune would have befallen them. Illness, bereavement, accidents, or just plain bad luck. Some of the C7ers, as I came to call them, I never did see again, and I spent time wondering if something awful had happened to them. Some, I heard, had left town suddenly. Others couldn't take living in this miserable town any longer and moved on. I hope their lives turned around when they were far away from seat C7, but I guess I'll never know. The whole thing gave me the creeps. It was just so weird, but there was actually one benefit. On a Wednesday, when my ex turned up with her new boyfriend in town, I was always sure to give her the best seat in the house. After all, she deserved it.
My roommate and I decided to have a short break away somewhere. We both had boyfriends who unofficially lived with us, so we decided to just have a girly weekend away. My roommate, Shiarn, convinced me to stay in this cute little cottage that was a little bit more expensive than I would like to have spent, but it did seem much nicer than staying in a motel, and it was much cheaper than a hotel. We booked it and 2 weeks later arrived for our holiday. The key was in the key safe, and there was a list of things we needed to know on the kitchen countertop, such as how to work the AC and hot water. The cottage was obviously looked after by someone who had OCD, as everything was laid out perfectly. It's hard to paint a picture, but imagine the finest cutlery, all laid out in order of size and purpose. All the jars and cans in the cupboard were in alphabetical order, with the label facing out. Although we laughed, it was a bit creepy, but I suppose first impressions are everything, and we were impressed, so I guess it worked. It was fair to say at that point that Shiarn had made the right choice in convincing me to go there. The first night, we decided to cook a meal together and opened a bottle of wine. We were joking and laughing, and quite unexpectedly, Shiarn asked me if I had ever thought about cheating on my boyfriend, and I told her honestly that I hadn't. Shiarn told me that she had often thought about it, and if ever the opportunity came up and the guy was cute, then she would probably give it a go. I was shocked by this, as Shiarn always seemed like the type to be faithful and loyal. The conversation and night moved on, and we went to bed around 11 p.m., as we had a full day planned the next day. The next day we went shopping and saw the sights of the city, and afterwards we decided to go to a few bars. We both had shopping bags with us, so we didn't intend for it to be a late one, or at least I didn't.
As we were sitting there drinking, Shiarn pointed out two men who were glancing over at us.
"Let's get them over here,"
Shiarn whispered.
"We can just do a bit of harmless flirting. No one will know."
Before I could even object, Shiarn waved the two men over. They were both in their mid to late 30s, good-looking, nice suits, and appeared to be rather successful. We got to talking, and I have to admit, I actually enjoyed myself. I flirted a little, but when asked, I told them I had a boyfriend. One of the men asked Shiarn if she was single, and she said yes. Even though she had told me the night before that she would cheat if she got the chance, I never thought she would go through with it. I saw this as a red flag and asked the men to get us some drinks. They willingly obliged, and I took this opportunity to try and get my friend out of there. Shiarn refused to leave with me, saying she was having too much of a good time and didn't want the night to end. I picked up all the bags and grabbed her arm, but she was loud and obnoxious and started to cause a scene. One of the two men we were talking to came over and asked what was happening. I said it was time for us to leave, and Shiarn slurred out that she wasn't going anywhere. The man leaned in and whispered in my ear,
"If you want to go, then go, but your friend wants to stay, so she stays."
He said this quite assertively, and I didn't want to get dragged into whatever mess Shiarn was about to create for herself, so I called Shiarn's bluff and said I was going to get a cab and walked out. She didn't follow me. I went back to the Airbnb and waited up for Shiarn to come home, but as it got closer to midnight, there was still no sign of her. I texted her to make sure she was okay, and eventually I received a response. She said she was out having a good time and not to worry. I had had enough and decided to go to bed. She was a big girl, and I had tried everything I could to help her. I went to sleep and woke up sometime later. I had no idea what time it was, but I could hear Shiarn in the next room, and she wasn't alone. She was actually going through with this. I pulled my duvet over my head and went back to sleep, telling myself it's not my business. Soon after, even though I was sleeping, I felt a presence in the room with me. I remember opening my eyes and waiting for them to adjust. As I did, I saw the silhouette of a man sitting next to me on the bed. I screamed,
"Hey, it's okay, it's me, the guy from the bar."
I screamed at him to get out, and he left the room calling me a crazy bitch on the way out. There was a small chest of drawers in the room, which I pushed behind the door to make sure he wouldn't get back in. That morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even tell Shiarn that I was going. I had considered her one of my best friends, and she put me in a situation that made me really uncomfortable, and I wasn't sure at that point if I could forgive her. When I arrived home, my boyfriend was packing his things to leave. I asked him what he was doing, and he showed me a photo message he had received from Shiarn. It was a picture of me and the man in bed. We were both under the duvet, and he was laying behind me with his arm over me. As far as photos go, I looked guilty. I still to this day don't understand how he climbed into bed with me without waking me up. My boyfriend wouldn't even give me the opportunity to explain, let alone believe me. That day, my boyfriend moved out, and I haven't seen him since. I tried to talk to him, but he ghosted me. I tried to talk to Shiarn's boyfriend about what happened. He blamed me, saying just because I got caught out, that I shouldn't try and ruin their relationship. Shiarn and her boyfriend are still together, and I moved back in with my parents. I tried to do the right thing, and it all blew up in my face. It still haunts me.
Me and my two twin cousins, Lance and Larry, would often go camping out in the woods near our house. There was a spot we would camp every time, so our parents knew where we were. It was easily accessible through our garden, as it backed onto some woodland. My dad would come to check on us throughout the night to make sure we were safe and not doing anything that we shouldn't be. Sometimes we would hear my dad creeping in the bushes, trying to spy on us without interrupting our night. He most likely thought that if he made himself known, then as soon as we knew he was gone, we would misbehave. Most of the time, we would just be cooking hot dogs on a fire or making s'mores and telling ghost stories. In our first year of high school, Lance and Larry both got girlfriends, and they told them about our camping trips and they asked if they could join us one night. Our parents would never let us camp out with girls at that age unsupervised, so we all agreed to keep it a secret. Girls said they would tell their parents they were sleeping at each other's house and sneak over with sleeping bags. It's a plan that we would take 2 tents as normal, but the girls would have to wait and hide inside one of the tents until my dad had been and gone. Everything went according to plan. We set up the tents, the girls snuck over with their sleeping bags, and we lit a fire to keep us warm and sit around. As Lance was telling his favorite ghost story, we heard the cracking of twigs and crunching of leaves behind us. We could hear footsteps slowly approaching. "My dad's coming! Hide!" I yelled to my dad to let him know we were aware he was watching us, but there was no answer. I yelled again, but still, nothing. We continued doing what we were doing, and eventually we heard Dad's footsteps leaving. Dad was gone. We were now officially unsupervised. The girls came out of the tent and sat closer to the fire. We told more stories and roasted some more of the marshmallows we had. As we sat there talking, we heard a branch snap somewhere behind the tents. We shone our flashlight over in that direction, but we couldn't see anything. A few minutes later, we heard footsteps creeping round the other side of the trees. Someone was with us, watching us. I thought it might be my dad, but he never came after dark.
Hello? Is anybody there?
No one answered, and we just continued our night thinking it was an animal or something. Then we saw a flashlight coming towards us. This time it was my dad. He caught us sitting there with the girls. My dad told us that the police had visited our house as some peeping Tom was in the neighborhood. He came to get us and bring us home, knowing some weirdo was walking the streets. We got into trouble for having the girls there, and he rang their parents to come and collect them from the house. We left the tents there until morning, as it was too dark to pack everything up, but when we came back the next day, the tents had been trashed and torn to shreds. I don't think they ever caught the peeping Tom, and I have no idea if that was who trashed our tents. This story happened right as I was starting to get out on my own. I had just graduated college and accepted a new job in a new city. To take away the stress of bills, I decided to get a roommate. After months of nothing, I turned to Craigslist. I wasn't super thrilled at the idea, but I severely underestimated my expenses, and I was beginning to panic. Finally, I arranged to meet with a girl who was around my age. After talking for a day or two, we learned that we had a ton in common, even moving to a new place and new jobs. During the meeting, she was very shy. She was friendly, but definitely not an extrovert by any means. We talked for a good while, and nothing stuck out to me as a red flag. She seemed like she was just a typical woman who was trying to make it. I offered her the room, and she agreed, moving in that weekend. At first, things were fine. She was helpful, kept her space tidy, and bills were taken care of on time. It wasn't until 2 months in that things took a turn for the worse. It was a subtle shift. She started to lose touch of personal boundaries. I would be with my boyfriend in my room with the door shut, and she would barge in without even announcing. If friends were over, she would stay under our feet the entire time. If we wanted to go out, she would ask to join. Then it progressed to her being irrationally upset if I came home late from work or a night out. Getting annoyed, I talked to her and filed it in the back of my mind thinking it would be fine. It wasn't. My things kept going missing. Not just normal things either. My underwear, bras, and toothbrushes would just vanish. Then, the last 2 incidents were enough to send me over the edge. The first incident happened when I came home from work early. Inside the house, things were silent. I knew she was here because of her car, and I thought she was just sleeping. What I didn't know, but soon found out, was she was asleep, just in my bed instead of hers. I woke her up as soon as I registered it, and she apologized that it wouldn't happen again. I was beginning to get a bad vibe from her that just kept getting darker. Then, that same night, I went to bed like usual. I briefly woke up in the middle of the night because of a noise and realized she was watching me. I yelled at her to get out and locked my door, putting an accent chair under the knob for good measure. Still creeped out, I barely slept the rest of the time. I could hear her rifling around in her room until it went quiet around 3 in the morning. Since I had been up all night, I waited until she went to work the next day and decided I was going to find out what exactly was going on with my roommate. Now, I'm not normally the type to snoop, but I felt this urge to go into her room and have a look. Her room was neat, everything in its place. I took time looking at pictures, and it was odd that she didn't have any with her in them, not even family pictures. None of the pictures were of anybody at all. It was all pictures of landscaping, random spots of grass and trees. It reminded me of mediocre photography. I made my way to her closet next, assuming if I had important things that they would be in there. The first glance revealed it was messy, unlike her room. Then, there in a pile that was hidden under towels, stood a mountain of my clothes. I dug through, realizing that the only article of clothing that was missing from this pile was my undergarments. Beyond freaked out, I ravaged the rest of her room until I accidentally bumped into her nightstand, and an envelope that had tape on it hit the floor. My hands were shaking as I opened the flap and dropped the photos onto the floor. The photos were of me. In some, I was showering. In others, I was sleeping. Even pictures of me leaving work were all there. Completely scared, I began to back out of the room until I saw something keeping her mattress barely a centimeter off the box spring. Now that I saw the pictures, I was already expecting the worst, afraid it was my undergarments or more pictures. My finding under the mattress was confusing, but eerie. Stuffed under the mattress were 4 licenses. All the ID cards had different names, but the same picture of my roommate wearing this demented grin. Something told me that these ID cards meant nothing good, and that I needed to do something with them. When I got them to my room and started checking the names, I discovered that the names were of women who were missing. After I calmed down, I took the cards directly to the police station. I explained the situation, and since I had the cards, they believed me. I told them that my roommate was at work, and she would be back soon. We decided the best plan was to confront her at home, and I went back to wait for her. When she came inside, cop cars wailed and lit up the road outside. She turned and looked at me when she heard them, giving me this creepy, dead eyes smirk. I still remember what she said to me when she left. "Guess that's my ride." Those were the last words she said to me. I still don't know what came of the women on the ID cards, or what she had done to expect police, but I also think I don't want to know. I was in my junior year of college and had just turned the magical age of 21, so naturally I was partying hard almost every weekend. This particular Saturday night, my friends and I had been having some drinks at a new bar, and it was located a while away from our dorms. Normally, we'd visit the same few places, which were all a walkable distance from campus, so we didn't have to worry about designated drivers or taxi fees. But this particular occasion was right after a really rough exam week for those of us majoring in physics, so we figured we deserved a treat. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, I had drunk too much, and it was time for me to make my way home. At that point, it was still early, so I didn't really expect my friends to leave with me. Plus, if they knew I was trying to leave, they would try to convince me to stay and drink more. So instead of interrupting them, I just took myself outside and ordered a cab. After a few minutes, a car pulls up to the curb, and I instinctively get in. I vaguely remember the driver to be this 30-something and wearing a baseball cap. Since I've already put the address in the app, I didn't really say anything other than hello. Literally not even 2 minutes after the car starts moving, I begin to feel like I'm going to be sick. So I mutter something like, "Hey, do you mind if I lay down? I feel sick." And the driver just says, "Sure." I lay down, in a position that ensures that I can't see all the buildings and houses we're rushing past out the window. 10 minutes into the ride, my phone buzzes, but I'm so dizzy and drunk that I just ignore it at first. 30 seconds later, another buzz. Ignored. 10 seconds after that, A third buzz, and this time I decide to check out what's so damn important, because I figure one of my friends can't find me at the bar and is trying to find out where I am. Nope. Instead, it's a notification from the taxi app.
Your cab has arrived.
I'm confused, but I touch the notification, figuring it just arrived late, and it takes me to the app. The screen loads the messages, sent 1 minute ago.
Your cab is waiting. White Honda Civic.
I panic immediately. I don't know what car I got into, but I knew it wasn't white. I sit up and look up from my phone to the person driving the car to realize I was not in a white Honda Civic and that this was not my cab. The driver looks at me, chuckles, and says, "Took you long enough." I look out the window and I don't recognize where I am. I try the back doors and the child locks are on. The driver looks at me in the rearview mirror and says,
Yo, relax. We'll be arriving at our destination soon.
I needed to think fast, and in my drunken haste, I threw myself forward between the front seats and grabbed the steering wheel, pulling it as hard as I could to one side until we crashed. I woke up in the hospital the next morning, sore and hurt, but alive. The good news is, I didn't kill anyone with the crash, not even my would-be kidnapper. The bad news? I only know I couldn't have killed him because I was the only person found in the wreckage. This took place only a year ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was in class approximately 40 minutes into second period when there was a loud explosion, which sounded like it was somewhere in the building. The walls rumbled and the windows shook. The whole class jumped like a flash mob doing a shoulder shrug and sat there looking at each other, trying to understand what was going on. We all started to grab our bags and jackets, thinking we were going to be evacuated for a bomb threat or fire, when the announcement came through the loudspeaker, telling us we were going into a full lockdown and to remain inside the classroom. This confused most of us, including myself. Why were we going into lockdown when it sounded like there was an explosion? You know what usually follows explosions? Fire. I didn't want to be stuck in a building with fire. A few of us started asking the teacher and shouting as to why we were being locked in when we should be evacuating. Miss Martin's answer was simple. Maybe they know something we don't. That actually made sense. We didn't know what was happening or why there was an explosion. There could be a bigger threat from us leaving the room. Miss Martin followed protocol, locking the door and pulled down a blind covering the glass window and told us all to move to the back of the class, which we did. Shortly after we had all sat down on the floor, we heard one of the main doors to the building slam closed. These were heavy fire doors, and our classroom was the first classroom down the hall from these doors. But the question was that someone coming in or someone going out? We all just sat there in near silence, looking at each other, trying to understand what was happening, when a faint whistling started making its way down the hall. The whistling reminded me of Negan from The Walking Dead. A long, droning whistle with only a slight variation of tone. We could hear it getting closer to our classroom as it became louder and louder, and just as it sounded like it was right outside our classroom door, it stopped. Someone then tried the doorknob. They started to shake the door and started banging on it as if kicking it aggressively from outside while they shook it back and forth. We all sat there clasping onto each other. I had 2 girl classmates sitting on either side of me, holding my hands. They were comforting me as much as I was comforting them. The door sounded like it could give way any minute, and then it stopped. The girl to my left, Katie, let out a scream and pointed to the door to see an eye peering through a small gap in the side of the blind. We all sat up in a panic, and then whoever it was just walked away whistling as they made their way down the hall. We didn't hear anything else until about 30 minutes later, when an announcement came through the speaker system saying the lockdown was over. By this time, all of the emergency services had arrived at school. I don't think they ever caught the man. I do know that no one was able to get a look at him and give a clear description. He covered his face for the cameras, as if he knew where they all were, so other than build, size, and clothing, the police knew nothing about him. There were rumors saying that it was an ex-student coming back to seek revenge on a teacher, but no one really knows. The explosion was caused by a gas can being put in a dumpster outside and being set alight. Some said the explosion was to make us all evacuate, so we would all run into the line of fire of him attacking us as we left.
Growing up, I was a little bit of a troublemaker. I had too much free time to do whatever I wanted, and not enough parental supervision. Well, at least that's what my grandmother used to tell me. My parents and I used to love to sit down and watch scary movies, even when I was only 13. The only exception being House of 1,000 Corpses. They wouldn't let me watch that till I was 16. Older me now understands why that was. However, growing up in my home, it was no shock to anyone that I loved the macabre and dark. The occult fascinated me. Not enough to practice in any of it, but I loved studying it. I thought that if I just studied it and nothing else, I would be safe. Let me tell you, that isn't how it works at all, and I wish I knew that then. I had just turned 16 when I was allowed to experience the freedom of my own car. By then, I was enamored with paranormal ghost shows and everything else that went along with them. Another one of my interests turned to abandoned places. Living in the South, my area is full of them. Usually, most of them are out in the middle of nowhere, and this one was no different. It was me and a few of my friends who were older than me. Most of them tagged along because of the simple fact that they brought their cameras. This time, it was me and a group of 3 others. 2 of the others were close friends of mine, and the third guy was just tagging along for the first time. During the car ride, we were filled with anticipation. The drive took us off a rocky gravel road to an area of land that sat untouched, except for one area. As we pulled in, we were met with a worn-out parking lot with weeds shooting up through the cracked surfaces. We parked the car and stepped out, coming face to face with our most determined conquest. There were steps that led down into 2 glass doors, with a giant sign labeling it as Memorial Mound. Looking back, I wish I could have listened to my gut feeling that this was actually an awful idea. The whole place felt wrong. It didn't feel dormant. It felt like something was very much alive about this place. And not only alive, but not happy. It was an oppressive feeling that weighed me down. I felt a strong urge to cry. Like most teens, I refused to show any weakness, and when everyone started to walk to the building, I went right along. We descended the steps, and we were shocked to see that a ladder was the only thing that led us down to the double doors that were originally glass, and which were shattered around the vicinity, and the opening was basically inviting us in. All of us froze for no more than a minute, taking in the surroundings around us before waltzing in. Before I go further, let me explain this place and why we were intrigued to visit. A man by the name of Clyde had been traumatized early on after he and his father found bones on their property. After witnessing that, he started to think that surely he could stop this from happening to anyone else. He figured that there had to be better spots for bones other than the ground. That was how the idea for Memorial Mound came into play, and in the 1960s, Clyde set out to make it a reality. To better explain it, imagine a mausoleum, but then bury it under 8 feet of the Alabama dirt. Complete with a chapel and a showroom, the wings held caskets that were stacked up to 10 feet high. In his setup, the most expensive plots were those that were closest to the ground. Things didn't go as planned for Clyde, and the idea never took off. So when he died in 2009, people nearly forgot about the mound, just like Clyde had before. Yet now, we were here. The first thing we noticed about the site was that it was absolutely ransacked. People had even stripped metal off of the chairs that sat cryptically in the chapel. The ground was littered with smashed glass and broken chips of wood. We all tiptoed through, snapping photographs of Bibles and hymnals shredded in the mess. The walls had even been graffitied. Continuing throughout, we managed to make it to another area of the site, one that we guessed to be the wings. One of the doors felt stuck, but one good push and we were in. In the blink of an eye, we were hit with a smell that was something like I had never smelled before. It caused us all to gag. We quickly threw whatever we could over our nose and mouths before we could go any further. The first person who successfully managed to take a few more tentative steps quickly realized what was wrong. Inside of the abandoned building were caskets. Not just empty caskets. but caskets still containing human remains. The smell was decaying bodies that were left forgotten and rotting. Some of the caskets had even been vandalized, with several pieces missing from the skeletons. Not wanting to be so disrespectful and potentially damage more remains, we quickly exited the building and called officers out to report our gruesome find. Considering we found bodies, they were willing to skip on potential trespassing charges and just told us to leave and not come back. They didn't have to worry about that. We had no desire to return. From what I found out later, most of those bodies in the building were returned to family members who had no idea they were left there. However, none of us were right after that find. Our trips definitely dwindled afterwards. We just felt off for a while. That smell, though, is something that I would remember right away. I ended up throwing away the clothes I wore that day. I couldn't get the smell of decay to get off of me. Sometimes, if I concentrate hard enough, it's like I can summon it back with one thought.
My name is Jesse, and I've been babysitting for the family next door since I was 14. They have a girl named Maggie, who's 6 now. She's really cute, and she's usually not too difficult. I only get $15 an hour, but every little bit helps as I save up for college next year. Last week, Maggie's mom called me up to ask if I could watch Maggie on Saturday. I was planning to hang out with a couple of friends at the movies, so I told her no. Pretty soon afterwards, I found out that my ex-boyfriend Ethan was going to the movies too, and I did not want to see that psycho again. So I canceled on my friends and agreed to babysit. That was a huge mistake. I got to the house at 7. Maggie's parents were running late as always, so they scurried around trying to get ready for some work party or something. They barely had time to talk to me before they hurried off. As they left, the mom told me that she left a note on the refrigerator with important information. I assumed it was the usual emergency contacts and stuff, so I didn't bother checking it out right away. At first, things were going great. Maggie was playing with her Legos. I sat on the couch and watched her. She told me about the castle she was building, and I pretended to listen. Then, out of nowhere, she stopped and whispered, "There's a man outside. He's watching you." I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. The trees were shaking a little. It could have been someone hiding in the shadows, or it could have just been the wind. We live in a pretty nice neighborhood, so I wasn't too worried. "It's okay," I told Maggie. "It's just the wind." "But that man was looking right at you," she said. "He was scary." My blood ran cold. Maybe she was right. I walked to the front door and made sure that it was locked and deadbolted. It was. Then I saw a movement in the yard. Someone was definitely out there, sneaking around. "I think it's a psycho murderer," Maggie said blankly. "It's not a psycho murderer," I told her. But just in case, I needed to find out. I unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. Their yard was filled with trees, so there were a lot of shadows outside, a lot of places for people to hide. I didn't see any movements, though. "Hey!" I shouted. "Who's out there?" There was no answer, but I saw some movement from the bushes. And then I heard some laughing. That's when I knew that it was Ethan, my ex. It had to be. He was so desperate to get back together with me that he had followed me here. What was his plan? I turned toward Maggie and told her to wait right there. I said that my friend was outside, and I was going to go out there and tell him to go away. "Don't go," Maggie urged me. "It's okay," I said. "I'll be right back." I walked through the dark yard. When I reached the bushes in the corner, I heard more laughter. It was very quiet, as if Ethan was covering his mouth while he laughed. "Ethan," I said, "what the hell are you trying to do? We are not getting back together." The laughter stopped. Then, someone whispered, "I'm not Ethan." I gulped. That was definitely not Ethan's voice. I had to get back inside. I turned around, ready to run, but a hand shot out of the bushes and grabbed me by the ankle. I tripped and fell to the ground. Then the man jumped out of the bushes. He was tall and thin, wearing a hospital gown. He looked furious.
What are you doing in my house?
He stood over me, inching closer. He reached forward, trying to grab me by the neck, but I twisted out of the way and stumbled back toward the front door. I ran inside and slammed the door behind me. As I twisted the lock, that man started pounding on the other side of the door.
Let me in!
He screamed.
It's my house!
I raced over toward Maggie and took her into the bathroom. It seemed like the safest place to hide. We locked ourselves in, and I called the police. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. The house was very quiet. Maggie kept asking me what was happening, but I didn't have any answers for her. I had no idea who this man was and why he thought he lived here. Maggie was sobbing, and all I could do was tell her that the police would get here soon. But after 10 minutes, the police still weren't there. I needed to go back out and see if the man was still waiting for us outside. I left Maggie in the bathroom and told her to lock the door after me. I walked around the empty house, looking for any signs of that man. I didn't see anything. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed the note that Maggie's mom had left for me on the fridge. I don't know why I decided to read it at that moment. I had other things to worry about, but I did anyway. It said,
Dinner's in the freezer, just microwave it. And if you see anyone trespassing, call the police right away. My brother was just released from the hospital, and he's been sending threatening notes. Don't tell Maggie, I don't want her to get scared. He probably won't come here, but just in case, do not go outside. Just then, there was a loud knock on the door. The police had finally arrived. I told them everything that had happened. Then, I called Maggie's parents to tell them to come home early. They paid me double, but I told them I wouldn't babysit for them anymore. Shortly after I turned 18, my parents kicked me out of the house. It wasn't surprising since we've never had a good relationship, but the stress from not having a home anymore was scary, especially because I was a woman facing being homeless on the streets. I ended up crashing on my best friend's sofa until she left for college, and I had enough to get a crappy apartment. And crappy is too nice of a word for the place I was renting, but at the time, it was the only place I could afford, and since I worked 2 jobs to afford it, it wasn't like I was home often anyway. Anyway, like I said, I worked 2 jobs full-time to support myself, but I never had anything left over after my bills were paid. So when my best friend sent me a food delivery gift card for my 19th birthday, I was ecstatic. I was used to ramen or boxed mac and cheese, so to be able to have takeout after over a year was more than I could ask for. My best friend was struggling at the time too, being a college kid and all, so the gift card was only $25, but for that, I was still able to order a basic combo meal at a burger shop. I saved it for my birthday dinner, and remember feeling so embarrassed that I couldn't afford to tip high. The gift card barely covered the food and the delivery charges, but I did manage to get together $2 that I found around the house, and felt proud that I could tip at all. The doorbell rang not long after I found the dollars, and when I answered the door, there was an older man who was frowning hard. He didn't say anything to me, but held out my bag of food. I reached out to grab the food from him, but he quickly pulled it out of my reach and asked angrily why there wasn't a tip added to the order. I felt so embarrassed at his words and shyly held out the crumpled $2, which he took, but not before laughing. He practically shoved the bag of food in my hands before he went off about how poor I have to be that I can't afford to leave a decent tip, how people without money shouldn't order out, how bad of a person I was for not giving him a proper tip for all the hard work he did. It went on, and after a couple of minutes of hearing the man yell, in which he kept stepping closer and closer to me, I gathered the courage to say a quick, "I'm sorry," and closed the door on him. Right when I turned my lock, the knob of the door started turning. He was trying to get into my apartment. I backed up away from the door as he knocked at first, but his careful knocking started to turn into banging on my door as he tried to turn the handle. All the while, the man screamed he wanted me to add a tip to the online order, otherwise he wasn't leaving. I was 19, alone, and didn't have anyone to call other than my best friend, who was at college out of state.
I knew if I called my dad, he would just hang up, and I was too scared to call the police and bother them when it was over something as stupid as a tip. I already felt bad that I couldn't give the man more than $2, so even scared, I felt like it was my fault. Eventually, my neighbors across from me opened the door and told the delivery man that she called the police and they were on their way. The man banged on my door a final time and called me a name I would rather not repeat, then left. I was shaking and crying uncontrollably that I didn't hear a word my neighbor was saying behind my door until I heard sirens. After talking me down, my neighbor convinced me to let the police, who she had in fact called, into my apartment and held my hand in encouragement as I told the police what happened. They took my report and helped me call the food delivery app to explain the situation, and they assured me that man would be banned from using the app in the future. But all I could think about was that, because of me, this man, who now knew where I lived, couldn't work. He was going to lose his job because of me, and he knew where I lived. I ended up breaking my lease and staying in the local shelter for a couple of months until I could afford a deposit on another place. I don't order food through apps anymore. I know now, years later, that I wasn't at fault, but still, you never know who you're inviting to your house when you order food. They can be a nice person, like my neighbor who helped me, or they can be a raving maniac that now has your address if anything bad were to happen.
I'm a female high school student, and sometimes when I'm not too busy with school, I babysit for a few of my parents' friends. I don't charge that much, but I've always liked the feeling of earning my own money. Plus, other than heating up dinner and putting the kids to bed, babysitting usually involves me lounging around watching trash TV. Who doesn't want to be paid for that? But recently, something happened that's made me apprehensive to continue with my babysitting gig. I'm scared of what happened and of everything else that could have happened that night. Spring was beginning to morph into summer, which is usually my busiest time, and I was babysitting the Murphy kids. They were among my favorite families to babysit for, as their kids were quiet and independent and pretty much left me with a ton of free time for myself. It was around 9 p.m., which means that I had already tucked them in and left them to drift off into sleep. I was reading a book in the living room when suddenly there was a knock on the door. I thought this was weird, as I wasn't expecting anyone, and the Murphys definitely had their own keys. Nevertheless, I made my way to the front door and looked through the peephole. To my surprise, it was a pizza delivery person. I hadn't ordered a pizza, so I opened the door to tell him that he must have the wrong address. "Are you sure? I was told this was the address." I insisted that I had not ordered anything, wished him luck, and shut the door. Not even 5 minutes had passed before there was another knock on the door. It was the same pizza delivery guy, still with his pizza box in hand. I cracked the door open and asked him what he wanted. "I confirmed the address with the store, and this pizza is definitely supposed to be delivered to this address." I replied that I hadn't ordered it. He said, "Okay, maybe your parents ordered it, or your boyfriend?" I rolled my eyes at the second part, hoping this random dude wasn't hoping to use this misunderstanding as an opportunity to hit on me. "I'm just saying, you should check. Seriously, miss, I could lose my job if I don't deliver these orders on time." At this point, he was really getting on my nerves, not because there was a mistake, but because he kept insisting that this was the right address, and acting like he would know better than me whether or not I had ordered a damn pizza. So, with a tone that I'm sure came across as annoyed, I told him that no one else was around to order anything either, and it was just me babysitting for the evening. Then I told him not to knock again and shut the door. I even stood on the other side of the door for a couple of minutes, just in case he knocked again. He didn't, so off I went back to the living room, picked up my book, and kept reading. But the encounter had left me feeling insecure and endangered somehow. I kept looking behind my shoulder, down the hallway at the front door, as if I were waiting for the pizza guy to return and become even more insistent that his probably cold pizza was mine. I saw the headlights of the Murphy's car shining through the window and felt a wave of relief. But it wasn't over. As I made my way to the door, wanting to greet the parents and go home as soon as possible, I heard what happened. I heard the car door open and close, fast and loud. I heard Mr. Murphy's voice, which was usually kind and calm, shout at someone I couldn't see or hear. He shouted, "Hey, who the hell are you?" Then another set of footsteps attempted to run away, and as I ran to the door, I saw Mr. Murphy run after them. I made it just in time to see him catch the pizza delivery guy by the back of his jacket and yank him so hard that he fell to the floor. The police were called and 2 officers showed up in minutes. They took the pizza delivery guy away, who, it turns out, did not work for a pizza place at all. In his possession, they found lock-picking tools, a crowbar, duct tape, zip ties, and a pizza box that had never had pizza in it at all.
I used to work at a gas station that was miles away from anywhere. My shift was due to finish in 15 minutes when a group of 3 teenage boys drove into the gas station in a sky blue pickup truck. They came into the store looking around like they were unsure of what they were buying before trying to buy some beer. You would regularly see this type of behavior in underage kids when trying to buy something like beer or tobacco. They picked up 2 six-packs and brought them to the counter. I ID'd them as a formality and refused service when they failed to provide any form of ID. The main boy, who thought he was some sort of smooth talker, asked me what I was doing later that night for Valentine's Day. I told him I didn't date kids and only liked real men. His friends laughed at him, which obviously hurt his macho ego, and he turned real nasty real fast. He started calling me names and saying I was a stupid bitch who would be working at the gas station for the rest of my life, as if I hadn't heard it all before. The boy walked over to the refrigerator, picked up 2 more six-packs, and told me he was taking them regardless of whether I charge him or not. I think he expected this to intimidate me. I told him he was free to take them without paying, but I would not be taking any payment for the beer as he was underage.
"What kind of dumb answer is that?" he said. "So you'd rather let me walk out with them than to charge me?"
I explained that if I take payment for them, then I would be liable to prosecution and risk losing our liquor license for the sale of alcohol to a minor. If you take them without paying, you'll be reported to the police for theft, meaning you'll be the one who's charged. The boy didn't like this response. He passed the beers to his friends, who just stood there watching the whole thing play out. He walked over to the counter, got in my face, and told me that his dad was high up in the police and he'd be able to get any charges dropped. I told him I didn't care, and that wasn't my problem.
"Take them or don't take them. Just do what you're gonna do, then leave, and take your goon friends with you."
He saw me look at the monitor, and then he looked outside to see Daryl, our night shift worker, pulling up outside. Daryl was the kind of guy you wouldn't want to mess with. He was hired to work the night shift for a reason. He laughed in my face.
"Well played, stupid bitch."
They walked out, got in their pickup, and left. Daryl came in, sensing something was off, but I said it was cool and they were just dumb kids playing around. I completed the handover and set off driving back home. It was about 20 minutes for me. I knew the roads well and could put my foot down. Several minutes into the drive, I saw some headlights in my rearview mirror. The car started to flash its lights as it swerved across the road behind me. The roads weren't safe if you didn't know them, especially at these speeds. I started to slow down, thinking whoever this was might be in trouble. As the car approached, I realized it was the boys from the gas station. They must have been waiting for me somewhere, with the lights off, and pulled out when I drove past. Despite my knowledge of the roads, my car wasn't fast enough to get away. They rear-ended my car 3 times, causing me to spin out onto the side of the road. They pulled up next to me, and the driver got out holding a knife. I locked my doors and moved to the other side of the car to where he was approaching. He stood there grinning at me.
"Not so clever now, are you?"
He then took his knife to my front right tire and then came back to the window, saying, "See you later, sweetheart," before spitting on my windscreen. It was 3 hours before someone drove past me, finding me at the side of the road. Thankfully, I had an SOS kit that had some food, water, and blankets in case I ever broke down. I reported the incident to the police and provided the footage from the gas station. Nothing ever came of it, though. Apparently, as there were no witnesses to the incident, the police said it was my word against his and that it would never hold up in court. I think his dad really did work for the police.
I live on my own in a 2-bedroom house. I used to rent out the spare room to tenants on a long-term basis, but when I heard about Airbnb, I learned that I could maximize the profits by charging more money for a short stay. Sometimes I could earn in a long weekend what I would receive for charging a month's rent, so it seemed like a no-brainer. This meant I either had the place to myself for a good portion of the month, or I was receiving a higher income for the month. Either way, it was a win. This one night, I received a booking from a new Airbnb user called Ella. When I say new, I mean her profile didn't have any feedback or anything indicating she had used the platform before. She had booked for 2 nights, and this was fine with me. Airbnb was pretty established at this point, and I would always take photos before and after to save arguments of damage. Plus, I had cameras installed in all the communal areas to protect me from damage or theft. The room I rented out was an ensuite bedroom and included a microwave and kettle in the room, so there was no real reason to leave unless you were leaving the house. Ella arrived, and at first glance she seemed nice, nothing unusual. We made some small talk, and she said she was just visiting some friends for the weekend and needed somewhere to crash. I showed her around and carried her bag up to her room and handed her her key and left her there. I usually just stayed in my room when people were over. The living room was off limits to guests, but usually when guests hear the television, they take it upon themselves to come in and chat, whereas people seem to respect the privacy of a bedroom a little more. That night I heard Ella walking around the house. She didn't make a lot of noise or anything, but I could hear the creaking of the floorboards as she tiptoed down the hall and down the stairs. I soon fell asleep, as I had been working all week, and when I woke in the morning, everything seemed normal, nothing unusual about the house. I saw Ella leaving and wished her a good day. It was that night where things got really weird. I heard Ella come home and remember looking at the clock next to my bed. It was 1:15. As Ella came up the stairs and down the hall, I could hear 2 voices, Ella's and someone else's. I had explained the rules of no other guests in the house without asking me first, so I jumped out of bed to tell her there would be an additional charge for anyone else. I opened my bedroom door and there was Ella, standing on her own. I looked down the hall and there was no one there. Ella looked at me stunned as to why I had shot out of the bedroom door so fast. "I'm sorry, I thought I heard more than one voice," Ella replied. "It's okay, it happens all the time." I smiled and closed the door. What did she mean, it happens all the time? I thought this was an odd thing to say, and it kinda gave me chills. I was convinced she was talking to someone though, so I thought I would check the camera footage. The footage didn't record audio, as I thought that was a bit invasive, but as I watched the playback, Ella did appear to be talking to someone. She was smiling, laughing, and even looking to her side as if someone else was walking through the house with her, but as far as I could see, she was alone. Then I heard a loud thud, which sounded like it came from the hall, more specifically, outside my room. I felt a bit weirded out from watching that video of Ella walking through the house talking to someone, so I switched to the live feed. Ella's face was right in front of the hall camera. I shouted to her to ask if she was okay. She turned around and walked back into her bedroom without saying a word. I never saw her for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night either. Sunday morning, I heard Ella's bedroom door close and heard her walking down the hallway, down the stairs, and then I heard the front door close. Most people thank you and say they had a nice time, but not Ella. She just left. Sunday night, still weirded out by the night before, I thought I would check out the cameras from Friday night too. Ella had been walking around the house for 3 hours in the middle of the night. But Ella didn't just walk around. She urinated in my kitchen sink, then went to the fridge and drank my orange juice straight out of the carton. Then she helped herself to my food, placing her hands in the likes of my cereal boxes and biscuits. She didn't even wash her hands after urinating in my sink. Then she walked just out of shot of the camera. I could see her arms moving, and then she walked over to the freezer,
opened it, put her arm inside, then closed it.
Did she just put something in my freezer?
I went to the freezer to check it out, and this grown-ass woman had taken a shit in her hand while in my kitchen and put it in my freezer. I was absolutely in shock at what I just saw. I reported her to Airbnb and submitted the footage. I received some compensation, but this girl was a freak and not right in her head. I think she was banned from the platform after that, and since then I've had no more weird encounters. Not yet, anyway.